Hey folks, I'm Jack Fossett, and welcome to this demo review and tone tips video for the classic, the workhorse, the Fender Hot Rod DeVille. This is the 410. We're going to dive in a second here and hear some tones before we talk about it a little bit more. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I hope you enjoy. So the Hot Rod DeVille 410, my guess is that a lot of you have probably played this amp in one of its forms at some point or another. These amps are super common. Right off the bat, I want to say that this amp is probably my favorite of both the Fender Hot Rod and Blues line, which are very similar. This amp has a superb clean tone that's worlds above where it should be based on its price point. Now this is an older model. This is one of the old silver top ones, so this is preceding the Hot Rod DeVille 3, which was when they switched over to the matte black. Now these are great amps. They do have some little quirks to them, and there are a lot of these around, so keep in mind that when I give you tone tips, the idea of tone tips in general is to give you a starting point and to maybe show you how to use an amp in a way that you might not expect. These sound good to me. They sound good in my setup with my guitars and in my, the situations that I need to use them for. Might not be the case for you, but hopefully, again, it gives you, maybe an avenue to say, geez, I didn't think about dialing it in that way. Maybe I'll try it, and then you can kind of tweak it from there. So that's the point. And while this is an older one, which does have some quirks, a lot of these tips are probably applicable across the board. Maybe not the quirkiness bits, but the other thing is first of all, there's a ton of these amps that always float around used. They kind of wind up being like grown-up trading cards. I mean, that's what it is, A lot of people buy, sell, trade gear, and you see a lot of these amps around. They're great workhorse amps. They're great gigging amps. You can even use them for recording if you know how to dial them in right. And you can usually get them for pretty inexpensive. The other thing is that you see these amps in a lot of backlines. A lot of clubs have these amps. If you're playing something where you're not bringing your own amplifier, they want you to use theirs, and they're great pedal platforms. So we are going to talk about this using some pedals. That's kind of part of the nature of these amps. We're going to do some stuff with just the amp. We're going to do some stuff with the amp and some pedals. If you don't believe me on the pedal thing, it could have no better endorsement than the great Michael Landau, who has his own version of the Hot Rod DeVille specifically designed as a pedal platform. It doesn't even have the gain channel. It has 2 volumes, and it's kind of designed for his using pedals to put into it. While it is a Hot Rod DeVille, it's kind of a different take on the Hot Rod DeVille. So we're going to stick to talking about this one right now. So as I said, there's a clean channel, there's a drive channel, and the drive channel also has a more drive button. Now, the general response to these amps from most people is that the cleans are great, the drive channel leaves a little bit to be desired. Now, I will say that that's probably pretty accurate in a lot of cases. The clean channel is fantastic. It gives you a great range. You have a lot of play on the EQ. It has a bright switch that's actually functional. You know, you get like other amps in the kind of extended series, like the Blues Deluxe, and it has a bright switch, and you're like, no, that's okay. You just hang out there by yourself. This one actually has a usable bright switch. It has a usable EQ. I'm going to give you a basic EQ tip on this. This is what I really, really find with this amp is being a 410, and this also comes in a 212 and kind of applies there too. They're very, very big and powerful amps, and they can get very bassy. You don't need a lot of bass. The other thing you really don't need a lot of is presence. The tone is just very present and has a nice sharp attack on it. So you can keep the bass and the presence rolled back further than you might on other amps. I like the presence between 3 and 5, depending on the setup, and I really keep the bass pretty much around 3, 3.5. I don't think you need a lot more bass than that. If you have a very thin sounding guitar, you can certainly use more bass. If you have a very, very fat sounding guitar, don't be afraid to use less bass. Don't be afraid to turn that bass down a little bit. The treble and the mids have a lot of play on them, which I really, really like. You don't get into too many harsh frequencies, and again, not nearly as many harsh frequencies as you see on the other amps in this line, this, again, extended line. So when I say this line, you get the Hot Rod Deluxe, you get the Hot Rod DeVille, you get the Blues Junior, the Blues Deluxe, and the Blues DeVille, and then there is also the Pro Junior, which is kind of in this different sort of thing. Now the treble. I really liked keeping the treble between 5 and 7, and that just depending on the guitar, there was a lot of nice range in there. As tube amps do, it gets pretty bright if you turn it up past 7-ish. Not in a necessarily like, oh, this amp has tons of harsh frequencies way, but just, it's a tube amp, and tube amps get bright. And a lot of times when you're playing, especially live, you only want enough treble to get you to cut through the mix and be heard. More than that can be very, very unpleasant for the audience, especially if your stage is at a level where the amp is pointing directly at people's heads. And so just be careful of treble. That's kind of a general tip across the board. Treble's important. You want treble to cut through to be heard so that you're not just Mud City Central, but you don't want too much treble. It's kind of a fine line. The mids knob on this amp I found very, very character defining. If you turn that mids up, it gets this really, really warm, fat, bluesy sound. If you turn the mids back, it also gets this kind of cooler bluesy sound, and that actually worked pretty well with some overdriven tones. I think getting into the drive channel in a minute, but I actually think the drive channel works a little better when you pull the mids back a little bit. Again, it's a very present amp, so you don't really need a ton of presence. Now, here's where one of the first real kind of quirky tone tips thing comes in. The reverb on this amp is a very bright, splashy, springy reverb. It's a real spring reverb, and Fender is classically known for great reverbs. Now, it's a nice reverb. It's very bright, it's very splashy, it's very reflective. And when I say reflective, here's what I mean. It almost sounds like the notes are kind of coming through the reverb and kind of bouncing around a little bit in there almost. Now, where that becomes a problem is sometimes those treble frequencies can sort of get accentuated by the reverb in a way. I found I really, really liked this amp best if I didn't use the onboard reverb and instead used a reverb pedal into the effects loop, which is the preamp out, power amp in. That can be used as an effects loop. So I found that if you use like a good reverb pedal and put it in the effects loop, the tone of the amp is better if you want to run it with reverb. Of course, if you don't use reverb, it's a moot point. But I definitely found that I liked this amp better using a reverb pedal than using its onboard reverb. Now, there's tons of mods out there that you can do to this amp. I'm not going to delve into that. I'm just going to tell you basically how you can get the best sound out of it stock. And again, as far as I know, on some of the modern models, some of these issues may have been addressed. And if you like the reverb, that's fine too. If you think it sounds great, it's not an unusable reverb. There are some good tones in it. I would generally say if you're going to use a lot of the amp's onboard reverb, maybe dial back your EQ a little bit, because it'll just sort of help those reflective tones. The brighter you run it, the more the reverb is going to sound kind of which is what you don't want. But it does sound great if you use that effects loop and use your reverb or delay or modulation effects into that effects loop. Now the drive channel, again, a lot of people think that the drive channel leaves a bit to be desired. I definitely think the drive channel is not as good as the clean channel. The clean channel is fantastic. The drive channel is not unusable though. One of the issues is that they share an EQ. That makes things a little bit trickier because, you know, if you have an amp where you can set them differently, then you can go from one kind of great to the other great. So on the drive channel, you definitely, I found, need to dial the EQ back more than on the clean channel. Like on the clean channel, if the treble sounds really good at 7, on that drive channel, I wouldn't put it past 5. I like having the mids pushed on this. A lot of times in these clips, I had the mids all, you know, up to 9. Sometimes I had it at 11. Just for posterity, you know. The mids I really wanted to pull back using the drive channel. If you want to use both channels, here's the way you can compensate for that, is to also use the bright switch. Because like I said, the bright switch actually works quite well. So when you're on the clean channel, you know, you can brighten it up that way if your EQ is pulled back a little bit. And then you kick on the drive channel, and that way you don't sound too muddy and dark on the clean channel, but the interaction's a little bit different there. Definitely want the EQ to be dialed back a bit if you're going to use the drive channel, and especially if you're going to use the more drive. Now, different guitars react differently too. Like, I found that the Stratocaster sounded a little harsh with the more drive, and that was with the drive pulled back to about 7-ish. I actually found with a humbucking guitar, you could push the drive more because, you know, with the humbucker and its mid-range boost, it seemed, the more drive at least seemed to like humbuckers to my ear a little bit better than single coils, which is actually kind of abnormal because I find that Fender amps and Fender guitars are just always a magical pair. And these two go together great. I'm not saying they don't go together great, but it really did, that more drive really did suit humbuckers. It had this nice kind of warm growl to it. Another tip that you can do is you can also dial back the gain quite a bit further. Use the drive, standard drive, as kind of like an edge of breakup tone, and then kick on the more drive for a kind of more mid-range gainy tone. Now the other tip, and I am going to show you how this sounds in comparison, is to use the number 2 input, because the number 2 input is not the same as the number 1 input. The number 2 input is a lower gain input. The common thing is to say, oh, well, you know, just it's common to kind of be like, well, I need more, I need brighter and louder. And it's just, trust me with this amp when I say you don't need louder. You ever get into a shower where on the shower dial, it's like right here is kind of unpleasantly lukewarm, and right here is 3rd degree burns? On the older amps, at least, and again, this is something I believe was corrected on the newer amps, the taper on the knobs, this thing gets really loud really fast. So the number 2 input kind of helps just tame things down a little bit. There's a little bit more sag to the tone, kind of a little bit more roundness to the tone, a little bit less edge. I definitely think using the number 2 input is worthwhile on this amp. It sounds great. You don't lose an awful lot. It just takes it down a little bit, kind of into a slightly more pleasant, slightly, again, a little bit saggier. The notes they're not quite, wow. You know, they're a little more, well, hey, let's hang out and talk about our favorite albums. That's what the number 2 input's like. And that's really it. Now, that being said, I still think that these are just the ultimate pedal platforms, and you're probably going to get the best tone if you have a nice overdrive to use with the clean channel, and just go with the clean channel. Again, this is what Michael Landau does. This is what a lot of players do. If you have it on a backline, know that you can take your pedal board and whatever you plug into this amp is probably going to sound awesome. It's a healthy thing to go into this amp looking at it as a pedal platform. Believe it or not, for a long time I performed with Fender Hot Rod Deluxe. It was a White Lightning edition. It had this beautiful white Tolex and a Celestion speaker. And it had the same kind of thing. And I used to use a Marshall Blues Breaker pedal and plug that into the clean channel, and that was my setup. It was the Hot Rod DeVille with the Blues Breaker pedal, and it just sounded great. And I never really thought twice about the drive channel, and I thought the drive channel was decent enough, but it sounded better with the Blues Breaker pedal. There are so many great inexpensive overdrives out there too that it really shouldn't be a detriment to say this is a pedal platform amp. Think about it that way. That's how you're going to get the best tone. Now for pedals, what I want to show you with this amp is, again, I've got a reverb and I'm going to do a delay, and we're going to do those into the effects loop. The reverb is a 1-control Prussian blue reverb. The delay pedal is a Lovepedal Echophonic. I'm going to show you the sound of 2 different overdrive pedals with this amp. A classic TS9 Tube Screamer, pedal that a lot of people are going to have, does sound great with this amp. But my favorite pedal with this amp, I mentioned using a Blues Breaker with the Hot Rod Deluxe. I think a Blues Breaker overdrive sounds phenomenal with this amp. And so I'm also going to use a Blues Breaker style overdrive. The one that I'm using is a Snouse Blackbox 2. This is a killer pedal. It sounds great with this amp. It sounds great in this setup. It's a little bit less gain than the Tube Screamer, but it really gives it just reacts so well with this amp. It gives a great bluesy, sort of silky bluesy, but still grinds when you dig in. It's just real nice sound. So I'm going to play both of those, and I am going to give you clips from the Drive channel, and again, hopefully give you some ideas on how to run this amp and what some great tones are. So the guitars that I'm using for this, now I'm using this guitar. I love this Stratocaster. This is a little bit of a tip of the hat to Michael Landau, of course. This guitar does also just sound great with this amp. This is a modified Highway 1 Fender Stratocaster in crimson red transparent. The pickups are Andrew Robertson Bluejays, which are kind of like a hot 60s Strat pickup. They just sound great, works great with the rosewood fingerboard. Also going to play a few clips with a Gibson SG. Gibson SG also sounds great into this one. I'm using my white SG. I love this guitar. That is loaded with Righteous Sound Pickups RAFs, which is their take on a PAF pickup. That sounds great into this amp. So you've heard both of them a little bit at the beginning. I'm going to go back and forth a little bit more and just show you, some of the different ways I found some cool tones in this. So please tell me, what is your experience with Hot Rod DeVille? Like, have you ever used one in a backline? Have you ever, had to go play on stage where this was the amp that was provided and you just plugged your pedal board in? Have you owned them? Which ones do you own? I would love to hear from some people who might own one of the newer ones, and I don't have experience with the newer ones. I know that they've upgraded some of the common player complaints about the older ones, so I would love to hear what somebody who maybe has a 3 or beyond has to say about it. If you have the Michael Landau one, let us know too, because that's a whole different kind of a flavor of Hot Rod DeVille. I'm Jack Fossett. Stick around for some more tones. I hope you found this video helpful. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.